Some cities, in the old Greek imagination, were simply built. Walls raised, streets laid out, a marketplace fenced and settled. And some cities were founded the way this one was, out of a hopeless search for a sister who could never be found, a dragon's blood spilled into sacred ground, and an army of armed men who sprang up out of the earth itself and very nearly killed each other before the city they were fated to build had laid a single stone. Tonight, we follow the story of Cadmus, a prince sent out from his home on an errand no one actually expected him to complete, who searched the whole width of the known world for a lost sister, and who found instead, at the far end of that search, a monster, a goddess's counsel, and the strange and violent seed of one of the most important cities in the whole of Greek myth, the very city, though he could not have known it yet, where his own descendants would one day live out some of the darkest tragedies these old stories ever told. To understand how a search for one missing girl became the founding of Thebes, we must begin, as we so often must, with the wandering eye of Zeus. Cadmus was a prince of Phoenicia, son of King Agenor, and he had a sister named Europa, a young woman of such extraordinary beauty that she drew, as beauty so often did in these old tales, the attention of the king of the gods himself. Zeus, seeing Europa gathering flowers with her companions on the shore near her father's kingdom, transformed himself into a magnificent white bull, gentle and beautiful beyond any ordinary creature of the herd, and walked calmly among the flowers until the princess, charmed by his tameness, climbed onto his broad back to admire him more closely. And the moment she was seated, the bull rose and walked, unhurried, into the sea, and carried her away across the whole width of the water, out of sight of her weeping companions, on the shore all the way to the distant island of Crete, where Zeus revealed his true nature and made her, in time, the mother of children who would themselves become legendary kings. Europa never returned home. And back in Phoenicia, her father Agenor, understanding nothing of what had actually happened to his daughter, only that she had vanished from the shore without any explanation, did what a desperate and grieving father in these old stories so often does. He sent his sons out in every direction to search for her, and he laid upon each of them a hard and specific condition. "Do not return home," again he told them, "until you have found your sister, or brought back certain news of what became of her." It was, in effect, a kind of exile disguised as a quest, and it fell hardest upon Cadmus, who took his charge more seriously and traveled further than any of his brothers. He searched through country after country, following every rumor and every scrap of hearsay that might lead him to Europa, and found at every turn nothing at all. For how could any mortal search ever hope to track a girl who had been carried away, not by any ordinary abductor, but by the king of the gods himself, across a distance and by means no mortal investigation could ever hope to trace? Cadmus wandered for years, his search growing more hopeless with every country he passed through, and failed to find her in, until at last, weary, and without any remaining thread to follow, he did what desperate wanderers in these old tales so often eventually do. He went to consult the oracle at Delphi, hoping for some divine guidance on where his impossible search should turn next. But the oracle, when it finally answered him, did not tell him where to find his sister at all. It told him, instead, to give up looking for her entirely, and to do something else altogether. "Cease your search," the oracle instructed him, "for it will never succeed. Instead, find a particular cow, marked with a crescent moon upon her flank, and follow her wherever she wanders, and do not try to guide her or hurry her along in any direction of your own choosing. Simply follow. And when at last the cow grows weary and lies down to rest of her own accord, that is the place where you are to found a new city, a city that will belong entirely to you, and that will carry your name and your line forward long after your search for Europa has been forgotten by everyone but the oracle that once spoke of it. It is worth pausing on the strange mercy hidden inside this instruction, because it is easy to hear it quickly and miss what it is actually offering him. The oracle was not simply refusing to help him. It was redirecting an impossible grief, a search that could never, by its very nature, succeed, into something entirely new and entirely his own to build. Rather than leaving him to wander forever, hopelessly, chasing a sister the gods themselves had already placed permanently beyond his reach. Cadmus, whatever sorrow he still carried for Europa, accepted the oracle's new charge, and found the cow exactly as it had described, marked with its pale crescent moon, and began to follow her, patiently, wherever her own wandering hooves happened to lead. The cow led him a long and winding way, through the region of Boeotia, until at last, in a quiet and fertile valley, she grew tired, and lowered herself to the ground to rest, exactly as the oracle had promised she eventually would. And Cadmus, understanding that this was the place, the spot upon which his whole future and the future of a city not yet built now rested, prepared to give thanks to the gods properly, as any pious founder of that age would have done, before laying the first stone of anything. He sent some of the men who had accompanied him on his long search to a nearby spring, to fetch pure water for the sacrifice he intended to make. And it was here, at that ordinary and unremarkable spring, that the story's first true test arrived, and arrived in a shape no one in Cadmus's party had any reason to expect. The spring, it turned out, was sacred to Ares, the god of war, and it was guarded by a monstrous serpent, or dragon, some tellings say born of Ares himself, vast and armored and utterly merciless, coiled around the water, that no ordinary traveler was ever meant to disturb. When Cadmus's men approached to draw water, the guardian dragon fell upon them, and killed nearly every one of them. Before any could raise a proper defense, its coils, and its jaws, making short and brutal work of men who had survived years of wandering search only to be slaughtered at the very spring, meant to bless the founding of their new home. Cadmus, waiting nearby, and growing anxious at how long his men had been gone, went to investigate, and found instead the wreckage of his own company scattered around the sacred spring, and the enormous serpent still coiled there, sated but watchful, guarding water that had cost him nearly every companion who had followed him this far. What followed was a desperate and singular battle, one man against a monster that had just destroyed an entire company of armed men, and Cadmus, grieving and furious in equal measure, fought the dragon with a courage the old poets clearly wanted us to notice and remember, for it stands, quite deliberately, as the first true test of the man who was about to found an entire city, and cities, these old stories seem to insist, are built by exactly this kind of unflinching resolve in their founders. He struck the beast with spear and stone, dodging its lunging jaws and its crushing coils, until at last, through sheer determination as much as skill, he drove a blow home that the creature could not survive, and the guardian of the sacred spring lay dead at his feet. The water finally safe again, for the sacrifice he had originally only meant to make in simple thanks. But even in victory, Cadmus was not left entirely alone with his triumph, for the goddess Athena, who watched over the founding of cities and the deeds of clever and capable mortals, with particular interest throughout these old tales, appeared to him, where he stood over the slain dragon and gave him instructions stranger and more unsettling than any he had yet received. "Take the teeth from the dragon's jaw," she told him, "and sow them into the freshly plowed earth of this very valley, exactly as a farmer sows grain, and see what grows from them." Cadmus, who had already learned across his long wandering search that the strangest instructions in these old tales so often carried within them the seed of exactly the outcome he needed, did as the goddess commanded, and plowed a section of the valley floor, and planted the dragon's teeth into the furrows, row upon row, and waited. What grew from that grim and unusual planting was unlike any harvest a mortal farmer had ever reaped before. Up from the plowed earth rose, not shoots of grain, but fully grown and fully armed warriors, spears and shields already in hand, clawing their way out of the soil, exactly as such earthborn armies would rise again, in a story this channel has already told, when Jason faced the same trial generations later in the very kingdom of Colchis, where these same dragon's teeth had, by some tellings, once originated before ever reaching Cadmus's own hands. It is worth pausing on this echo, because the old Greeks themselves clearly meant for these two stories to rhyme with one another, across the whole span of their mythology, the same teeth, or the same terrible principle at least, producing the same impossible and instantly hostile army wherever they were sown, as though the earth itself, once seeded with a dragon's violence, could only ever answer back with more violence in return. Cadmus, watching this armed and instantly hostile army rise up around him, faced the same desperate calculation Jason would one day face in his turn, though he arrived at his own solution through instinct rather than any borrowed advice from a foreign sorceress. He hurled a stone into the confused and still forming ranks of the newly risen warriors, and the trick worked exactly as it would work again in Colchis generations later, the earthborn men, each blaming the stranger nearest to him for the unseen blow, turned on one another in a sudden and total fury, and cut each other down in a chaotic and bloody battle that Cadmus himself never needed to enter directly. When the fighting finally ended, only 5 of the earthborn warriors remained alive among the slaughtered ranks of their own brothers, and these 5, their fury finally spent, and no enemy left to blame it on, laid down their weapons at last, and offered themselves, instead of continued violence, as loyal companions and subjects to the man whose planting had brought them into being in the first place. They were called the Spartoi, which means the sown men, and it was from the stock on these 5 survivors. The old tellings insist that some of the noblest and most ancient families of Thebes would one day trace their own lineage, an entire city's founding aristocracy, descended, quite literally, from an army born out of a dragon's own teeth and a single well-aimed stone. But there was a price still owed for the killing of Ares' own sacred guardian, and the gods of this world, as we have seen again and again across every story this channel has told, rarely let such a debt go unpaid. Indefinitely, however justified, the killing might have seemed to the mortal who did it. Cadmus was made to serve Ares directly for a period of penance, by most tellings, a full 8 years, an entire cycle the old Greeks associated with certain sacred reckonings of time, laboring in the war god's service to atone for the blood of his sacred dragon. Before he was finally permitted to return, his debt settled, to the valley where the cow had once lain down to rest, and to begin, at last, the proper business of building the city the oracle had promised him. And when his service was finished and his penance paid in full, something remarkable happened something that reads almost like the gods themselves, finally softening toward a man who had endured so much loss and so much labor simply to arrive at the place he was always meant to build. Zeus himself, along with the rest of the assembled Olympians, gave Cadmus a bride, and it was no ordinary woman they gave him, but Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite themselves, the daughter, that is, of the very god whose sacred dragon Cadmus had slain, and of the goddess of love, so that the wedding, when it finally took place, brought together in a single ceremony the two families whose earlier conflict, dragon and dragon slayer, might otherwise have poisoned this new city before it was even properly founded. It was, by every old account, one of the most magnificent weddings the mortal world had ever witnessed, attended by gods and goddesses in person, the muses themselves singing for the bride and groom exactly as they would sing. Generations later, at another wedding this channel has already followed, the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, whose own golden apple would one day set the whole world alight in the Trojan War. It is worth noticing, quietly, how many of the great catastrophes and glories of Greek myth trace themselves back to a wedding attended by every god at once, as though the old storytellers understood something true about even the happiest of unions, that whenever gods and mortals gather together in celebration, something enormous, for good or for ill, is very often about to be set in motion. With Harmonia as his wife and his penance behind him, Cadmus finally built the city the oracle had promised him upon the very spot where the cow had lain down, and named its central citadel the Cadmea after himself, and it grew, in the years that followed, into Thebes, one of the great and enduring cities of the whole Greek world, a city that would go on to produce some of the most towering figures and the most devastating tragedies in all of Greek storytelling. And here, at the very height of Cadmus's own triumph, the story quietly plants a seed of foreboding that the old audiences who first heard this tale would already have known the full and terrible shape of, even if we are only now, on this channel, beginning to trace its outline. For it was from this very city, founded by this very man, that generations later would come Oedipus, whose own tragic story, the plague upon Thebes, the curse he never knew he carried, the truth that finally destroyed him, we have already told in full on this channel. The house that Cadmus founded upon a slain dragon and a sown army would, across the generations that followed him, prove to be one of the most cursed and sorrow-laden royal lines in the whole of Greek myth, as though the violence buried in the soil at its very founding, the dragon's blood, and the earthborn warrior's own fratricide, had never quite finished working its way up through the family that grew from it. Cadmus himself, though, was not made to watch the worst of those later tragedies unfold, for his own long life ended by the old and stranger tellings, in a manner that circled back one final time to the very dragon whose death had both cursed and founded his entire fortune. In his old age, grieving the losses and misfortunes that had already begun to fall upon his descendants even within his own lifetime. For tragedy, in the house of Cadmus, arrived early and often. He is said to have cried out in his sorrow that if the gods so loved a serpent's life, so devoted to punishing his own house for the killing of one, then he wished he might simply become a serpent himself, and be done with the burdens of mortal kingship and mortal grief entirely. And the gods, in one of the stranger and more merciful transformations in the whole of Greek myth, granted his wish. Cadmus, and his faithful wife, Harmonia, beside him, refusing to be parted from him, even in this, were both transformed into great serpents, gentle and harmless, despite their fearsome new shape, and they lived out whatever remained of their long existence together, in that form, coiled peacefully, side by side, the very same shape as the dragon whose death had once both founded and cursed everything Cadmus had ever built. And so we return at the very end to the question this long and winding story was quietly built to ask. What does it mean to found something lasting out of a search that could never succeed and a violence that could never be fully atoned for? Cadmus never found his sister Europa. He spent years of his life chasing a task the gods had already made impossible before he ever set out on it, and it was only when he finally accepted that some searches cannot be completed and let the oracle redirect his grief into something new to build instead, that his story actually began to move forward at all. And even then, what he built was never entirely clean. A city founded on a dragon's death, populated in part by an army born of that same violence and forced to slaughter its own brothers before it could settle into peaceful loyalty. A royal line that would carry the shadow of that founding blood forward for generations. Into tragedies no city should ever have had to bear. And yet Thebes stood and endured and became one of the great cities of the ancient world regardless, built, in the end, not despite its violent and unresolved beginnings, but somehow through and alongside them, exactly as so much of what endures in this world is built, imperfectly, at real cost, out of grief that could not be undone, and debts that could never be fully repaid, but built anyway, because a man once decided that an impossible search was not, in the end, a good enough reason to build nothing at all. Rest now. Let the old valley settle into its long, quiet centuries, the dragon's spring running clear again at last, and somewhere in the tall grass, if the old story is true, two gentle serpents still rest together, coiled, side by side, at peace, at the very end, with everything the beginning once cost them.